Right, after 1831, there was a lot of controversy. It was obvious to the gentry that the law wasn't working. I mean, it was extremely expensive to preserve game. They spent vast amounts of money on it, and they lost an awful lot of their animals to poachers, particularly to night poachers, who came in gangs and were often very intimidating and often had these great fights with the keepers, in which keepers sometimes got killed and poachers sometimes got killed, and when people didn't actually die, they were often severely injured. So they wanted to change, and what the 1831 Act did was it made it for the first time legal to buy and sell game, but you had to have a licence to do it. So first of all, you had to be legally entitled to take it, to hunt the game, and I'll say what that was in a minute. So you couldn't sell it if you couldn't have come by it legally. You could only sell it to people who were licensed dealers as well. But that was the first time that it became legal to buy and sell it. You had to have a certificate in order to game. Now, there'd been certificates before. Before, gentlemen who wanted to hunt had to have a certificate, but they'd got plenty of money and they just purchased a certificate without thinking about it. And you could only purchase a certificate if you were qualified to shoot game, if you're a member of the aristocracy or the upper gentry. But after 1831, anybody could purchase a game certificate. So if you were an impoverished labourer or framework knitter earning 8 or 9 shillings a week with a family to feed, you could theoretically go and buy yourself a game certificate for £3.10. But of course, you were not very likely to do that, because it was an incredible amount of money for you. And also, apart from that, you still had to have permission to shoot where you were going to get the game. And what happened after 1831 was that the poachers who were prosecuted, the ordinary working class poachers who were prosecuted, usually on one of 2 counts, not having a certificate, which of course they virtually never did have a certificate, or trespass. And they would be trespassing on enclosed property, and that was what got them. Because if you were a gentleman, the gentleman's code would say, it's okay for you to come and shoot on my land. I'm quite happy about that. And you occasionally in the newspapers get notices, and in the coffee houses, from gentlemen putting up notices saying, I don't want anybody to shoot on my land because I'm strictly preserving and I've got problems, so nobody has permission to shoot on my land unless they've received written permission from either me or my head gamekeeper. So sometimes the landowners did say, nobody, even gentry, can shoot on my land. But most of the time they allowed other gentry to shoot on their land. So that was the unspoken code. And of course, if you were a labourer or a framework knitter, then you weren't going to have that permission. You were going to be prosecuted for trespass. The black market didn't subside at all. The fact that it became legal to deal in game didn't seem to make any difference to it at all. There was more game being sold legally and openly, but there seemed to be just as much game being sold illegally. And part of the reasons for this was that the rise of the sort of slightly well-off, perhaps you call them middle-class people, were starting towards the middle of the 19th century, and there was a bigger and bigger market for people who wanted to eat game. So it didn't change the situation with the black market at all. Just to go back a bit to what it was like before 1831, the lord of the manor had the right to all the game on his manor, not just the land that he owned, but the land that other people owned as well, if they were not people who were qualified. So if in your manor there was land that belonged to another gentleman, he would be entitled to shoot the game on that if he qualified, i.e. if his land was worth, I think it was over £100 a year, and obviously all these things were legally assessed because there was land tax. So if somebody else in your manor owned some land, then okay, he'd be entitled to take the game from that land. But you as the lord of the manor would as well. And if he wasn't qualified, if he was quite a well-to-do person who considered himself a gentleman, but he wasn't qualified, then he would not be allowed to take any of the game off his own land, and you would. So the lord of the manor was entitled to have all the game on his manor, not just the land that he owned. And there were forests and chases forests were not places full of trees. They were large hunting grounds, basically, and they were called forests if they'd originally and possibly still belonged to the crown, and they were called chases if the right of hunting in them had been given to a member of the aristocracy. So they're forests if they're royal, and they're chases if they're not royal. But forests or chases, either the king or some member of the aristocracy, had the right to all the game on that land. And Cannock Chase, one of the early studies in poaching, one of the sort of seminal works about poaching, is by Douglas Hay in Albion's Fatal Tree, which I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. It's just a wonderful book. Another one of these books that is for academic historians, but again can be read by anybody. Douglas Hay did a really detailed study in the second half of the 18th century about what was going on Cannock Chase, where the Pagets, I always make it a point not to understand these titles and things, because I want to take no notice of these people. I don't want to show them respect by understanding it. So whether they were Lord Paget or what they were, I think they might have been Lord something else, but the family name was Paget, had the right to everything on Cannock Chase. But it was a particularly contested right because it was in an industrial area. And there were quite a lot of little coal mines there. I mean, this was when pits were very heavily industrialised in the late 18th century. And so these villages were full of coal miners as well as agricultural labourers. And they weren't just going to sit back and take it like that. So they did constantly take, and there were still some deer around, and they did sometimes take deer, but they constantly took everything that there was on there. And there were particularly wars over rabbits. And rabbits are interesting because rabbits had been incredibly sought after in earlier centuries and still are right up until the 19th century, certainly in Nottinghamshire. Their fur was very useful for edging of clothing and for hats, and they could be eaten as well, of course. And they used to be farmed in areas called warrens, where often the start of the warrens would be dug out for the rabbits and they would be introduced to them. And sometimes people called warreners would be employed just to look after the rabbits and make sure that they were doing okay. And on Cannock Chase, as well as every sort of game you can imagine that the aristocrats wanted to keep for themselves, there were loads and loads of warrens and rabbits. And there were real wars fought over the rabbits because the local people had some commoners' rights to some grazing on Cannock Chase. And that meant they were allowed to put their sheep, and the sheep would be eating the grass, which of course the warreners wanted for the rabbits. And so the warreners would try to keep them out, and the local people would have the right to come there because they were allowed to graze, and they would dig the rabbits out, and they would take the rabbits out, and they would try and dig and destroy the warrens. And there were an enormous number of court cases over it. It's really worth reading. And some of the people who were funding the fight against the aristocracy on Cannock Chase were quite well-to-do people who were lower gentry, and they were putting money into buying lawyers to fight the case in court to show that the local people had the right of access to this. And they were also paid for people to come over from Charnwood Forest in Leicestershire, where there had been earlier rabbit wars, paid for them to come over to help in digging out the warrens. And of course, when they were physically digging out the warrens and the gentries, gamekeepers and warreners came, they would be fighting over it. It was something else that they would be having fights over. So who poached? Well, back to the 19th century now, because that's what I'm looking at. Basically, the poor from town and country. And as Douglas Hay says in his article in Albion's Fatal Tree, most poachers were poor, if only because most Englishmen were poor. And that was the situation, that the vast majority of people were poor. And even if they were in work, they were still poor. You do occasionally, pre-1831, find some instances of professional people. Clergymen in particular loved hunting. I found one of an attorney and some sons of esquires who were not the first son of the esquire, and so were not qualified, being prosecuted. But generally speaking, they weren't prosecuted. They would just be given a telling off. And if they were prosecuted, of course, they could pay the fine very easily. And a lot of the gentry didn't regard lower gentry poachers as real poachers. And there's quite a lot of discussion to be had about what the upper gentry and the aristocracy of the 19th century meant by the word poacher. Basically, if you were a member of the lower gentry, you could be doing exactly the same thing as a framework knitter or a labourer might be doing in the daytime, but you wouldn't be regarded as a poacher, just because you were further up the social scale. You know, you can quote some of the upper gentry saying, "Oh, I have no objection to people like this. Poachers are the lower classes, and they are a scourge." So the vast majority of people who were poaching, and after 1831, really all the people who were poaching were the poor, were working class people, because those people before 1831 who were quite well to do and not qualified to poach, after 1831 could buy themselves a game certificate. And then they just had to get over the hurdle of, would they be prosecuted for trespass? They just had to make sure that they actually were hunting somewhere where the person who owned the land didn't object. Taking animals at night was always regarded as poaching, and the gentry who hunted never did it at night. It wasn't sportsmanlike. It was perfectly sportsmanlike to shoot down birds in their hundreds when they were driven up by beaters. That was sport. But to shoot them at night was not sporting, because they were quiescent, they were easier to shoot at night, so that wasn't sport. So at any stage, if you were out taking game at night, you were poaching. Historians have not taken that much notice of poaching. It's not a popular topic to be researching. And it has been said that part of the reason has been that in the 1960s there was a sort of rise in interest in the start, really, I suppose you could call it, of social history, very largely under E.P. Thompson at the University of Warwick. And there was some interest in poaching, but not a great deal, and possibly partly because Marxist historians, and so far as I can gather from what I've been able to make out, people who are referred to as Marxist historians are not necessarily Marxists in their political beliefs. I mean, there are exceptions to that, i.e. Hobsbawm. And E.P. Thompson certainly started off as a Marxist in his political beliefs, but later in his life he categorically said he was no longer a Marxist. But the mark of a Marxist historian seems to be that they looked at history from the bottom up, rather than looking at prominent historians and acts of parliament and looking downwards. They looked at ordinary people and looked at how it was for them. Even they didn't seem that interested in poaching, or that interested in crime, really, possibly because Marxists have had a tendency to believe that all crime is a result of deprivation, and that if we had a more equal society, there wouldn't be any crime. But that's possibly a reason why a lot of the historians who were looking at history from the bottom up weren't all that interested in crime, and certainly not all that interested in poaching. But then that began to change towards the end of the 20th century, and to a certain amount, more interest in poaching, though it's still not an extremely popular subject.